I was holding a glass of champagne, standing in the middle of my living room, when my brother laughed and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "You know, Stella, this $1 million house is actually perfect for my kids." A few people chuckled, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. Before I could respond, my mother nodded and added calmly, "You're single. You don't need all this space. Family comes first." The room fell silent. For a split second, I felt that familiar pressure, the one I'd carried my whole life. The quiet expectation that whatever I built would eventually belong to someone else. But this time, something was different. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I smiled. I reached into my pocket, took out my phone, and connected it to the TV. "Since we're deciding who deserves what," I said evenly, "there's a document I think everyone should see." That was the moment my housewarming turned into a reckoning. Growing up, my family liked to describe us as close. That was the word my mother used whenever neighbors asked about us. Close-knit, supportive, traditional. From the outside, it probably looked true. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood. 2 parents, 2 kids, tidy lawn, matching holiday photos framed on the wall. My brother Ethan and I smiled the same way in every picture, him confident and relaxed, me slightly stiff, already learning how to take up as little space as possible. Ethan was older than me by 4 years, and from the moment he could talk, he filled every room he walked into. He was charming, loud, and effortlessly certain that the world would make room for him. Teachers loved him. Relatives excused him. And my mother built her world around him. "He's just more sensitive," she would say whenever Ethan lost his temper. "He needs more support," she'd add when he failed a class, quit a job, or changed direction for the 3rd time in a year. I was the opposite. Quiet. Responsible. The one who never caused trouble. And in our house, that came with a price. When I did well in school, it was expected. When I struggled, it was invisible. I learned early that praise wasn't given to the child who worked hardest, it was reserved for the one who needed saving. And Ethan always needed saving. At family dinners, conversations revolved around his plans, his worries, his future. I sat there, nodding, clearing plates, absorbing the unspoken rule. Don't ask for too much. Don't need too much. Whenever I dared to speak up, my mother would smile tightly and say, "Stella, you're strong. You'll be fine." What she meant was, "You don't need help the way your brother does." By the time Ethan got married and started a family, that rule hardened into something permanent. He had responsibilities now. Children. A life that mattered more than mine, according to everyone but me. And I understood something painful but clarifying. In my family, love wasn't unconditional. It was allocated. The more you took, the more you were given. The more you endured quietly, the more you were expected to keep enduring. Back then, I didn't know how dangerous that belief would become. I only knew that one day, it would cost me far more than I ever imagined. By the time Ethan turned 30, he had everything my parents admired. A wife, a house technically, and 3 young children who became the center of the family's gravity. Lauren, his wife, was kind in a tired, apologetic way. She always looked like she was bracing for something, as if life had taught her to expect disappointment and adjust quietly. The kids were sweet, loud, endlessly energetic. And the moment they were born, Ethan stopped being my brother and became a father, a title my mother treated like a shield. "He has mouths to feed," she'd say whenever money came up. "You can't expect him to struggle," Dad would add, already reaching for his wallet. The rules shifted overnight. When Ethan lost his job after a disagreement with his manager, my parents called it bad luck and helped cover his mortgage. When I mentioned feeling burned out from working 2 jobs, my mother suggested yoga. When Ethan needed a bigger car, my parents loaned him the money. When I asked if I could delay a family trip because I couldn't afford the time off, I was told I was being difficult. I watched this pattern repeat itself so often that it became predictable. Ethan fell short. My parents stepped in. I adjusted. Every success of mine became an opportunity for redistribution. When I got a raise, my mother asked how much I could spare. When I talked about saving for a future home, she laughed softly and said, "Why would you need something so big? You're alone." Alone. She said it like it was a flaw I needed to apologize for. I didn't resent Ethan's children. They were innocent. But I resented the way their existence became a permanent argument against my right to want anything. as if choosing not to have kids meant I'd forfeited my claim to stability, comfort, or ambition. The worst part was how normal it all felt. No shouting. No dramatic confrontations. Just quiet expectations layered on top of each other until saying no felt like betrayal. I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled down for Ethan, things would balance out. I was wrong. Because the truth was, in my family, balance was never the goal. Dependence was. The first time my family tried to take something that was truly mine, I was 23 years old. I remember the evening clearly because it started so normally. My mother had invited me over for dinner, saying she missed me. That alone should have been a warning. By then, I had learned that affection in my family was often a prelude to a request. When I arrived, Ethan was already there. He was sitting at the dining table with his laptop open, sleeves rolled up, looking unusually focused. My mother moved between the kitchen and the table, setting plates down with forced cheerfulness. The air felt tight, rehearsed. We barely made it through the first few bites before Mom cleared her throat. "So," she said, folding her napkin carefully, "Ethan and Lauren have been talking about their next step." Ethan turned the laptop toward me. Spreadsheets filled the screen. Numbers, projections, highlighted cells. "They need to move," Mom continued. "The kids are growing. 3 bedrooms just isn't enough anymore." I nodded slowly. This part wasn't new. Ethan was always one step away from needing something bigger, better, more expensive. "We found a place," Ethan said, tapping the screen. "But the down payment is tight." That was when my name appeared on the spreadsheet. Not just my name, my savings, my account, my future. I stared at the numbers, my pulse thudding in my ears. "Why do you have that?" I asked quietly. Mom waved a hand as if I were missing the point. "We're just looking at options." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You're doing well, Stella. You always have been." Something cold settled in my chest. "That's my money." There was a pause just long enough for me to understand this was never meant to be a discussion. "You don't need it right now," Mom said calmly. "Ethan does." I looked from her to my brother, waiting for him to say something, anything, to acknowledge that this wasn't fair. Instead, he shrugged. "Come on," he said. "You don't even have kids." The words landed heavier than he probably intended. Or maybe exactly as he intended. "That money is for my future," I said. "I worked for it. And I work too," Ethan snapped. "I just have responsibilities you don't." Mom's voice hardened. "Family helps family, Stella." There it was. The phrase she used whenever she wanted compliance disguised as virtue. "I'm not giving you my savings," I said. My hands were shaking, but my voice didn't waver. "I'm sorry." The room went silent. Mom's expression changed first. Her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes sharp. I had seen that look before. It was the look she wore when things didn't go according to plan. "This isn't about what you want," she said slowly. "This is about what's necessary." "For who?" I asked. "For this family," she replied. "Ethan has children, you're single, you'll recover." Recover. As if giving up years of work was a temporary inconvenience, not a loss. Ethan scoffed. "You're being selfish." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "No," I said. "I'm finally being honest." Mom crossed her arms. "If you can't support your brother when he needs it, then maybe you shouldn't expect support from us either." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. I realized then that love in my family had always been conditional, and the condition was obedience. I left that night without dessert, without hugs, without an apology from anyone but myself for having believed things could be different. In the weeks that followed, the calls slowed. The warmth disappeared. Family gatherings became awkward, then optional, then rare. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner was a test. And by failing it, by choosing myself, I had unknowingly set the stage for the much bigger confrontation that would come years later, in a house they would never accept was truly mine. After that dinner, something between me and my family didn't just crack, it shifted permanently. No one called to argue. No one demanded an apology. They didn't need to. The silence did the job for them. Phone calls that used to come weekly slowed to once a month, then stopped altogether. Group chats went quiet. Invitations to birthdays and holidays arrived late, if they arrived at all. When I did show up, conversations felt stiff, cautious, like I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I understood the unspoken rule I had broken. I had said no, and in my family, no was a form of betrayal. So I stopped waiting for things to go back to normal. I threw myself into work not as an escape, but as a decision. If my family no longer saw me as someone worth supporting unless I sacrificed myself, then I would build a life that didn't require their permission. At first, it was exhausting. I worked long hours, took on projects no one else wanted, and volunteered for responsibilities that came with risk but little recognition. I was terrified of failure not because of the consequences, but because I knew no one would catch me if I fell. But slowly, something changed. I started getting noticed. A manager pulled me aside after a presentation and said, "You think differently. Have you ever considered leadership?" That question stayed with me. I changed companies once. Then again, 2 years later. Each move felt like stepping onto thinner ice. But each time, I landed on my feet. I negotiated salaries instead of accepting what was offered. I stopped apologizing for ambition. I learned how to speak clearly, firmly, without shrinking. And for the first time in my life, my effort translated into momentum. When I got my first major promotion, I didn't tell my family. I celebrated alone. I ordered takeout, sat on the floor of my small apartment, and let the silence surround me. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it was peaceful. With each raise, I saved aggressively. Not because I was planning something extravagant, but because I wanted security. Real security. The kind that couldn't be taken away with guilt, manipulation, or a disappointed look. I watched my family from a distance, through social media posts, through secondhand updates from relatives who still spoke to both sides. Ethan struggled, again and again. There were job changes, money problems, stress. My mother was always there, stepping in, smoothing things over, quietly fixing whatever mess had been made. She never mentioned me, and I never asked. Part of me felt relief. Another part felt grief. I wasn't angry anymore. I was detached, like I had finally stepped outside a storm that had been raging my entire childhood and was watching it from solid ground. By the time I turned 32, my life barely resembled the one I'd grown up in. I had a strong career, a solid savings account, friends who respected my boundaries, and most importantly, I had learned something my family never taught me. I didn't owe anyone access to my life simply because we shared blood. That was when the idea of buying a house first entered my mind. Not a symbol, not a statement. A home, somewhere that belonged to me. Somewhere no one could walk into and tell me what I deserved or didn't deserve. The search took months. I visited properties on weekends, ran numbers late at night, imagined futures I had never allowed myself to picture before. And when I finally found it, a modern home filled with light and space, I knew. This wasn't just a purchase. It was a line in the sand. I didn't tell my family while I was looking. I didn't tell them when I made an offer. I didn't tell them when the offer was accepted. I waited until the paperwork was signed, until the keys were in my hand. Only then did I send a simple message. I bought a house. I'm having a housewarming. Some part of me already knew what would happen next. Because people who are used to taking from you don't see your success as something to celebrate. They see it as something to claim. And standing in my new home days before the party, walking through empty rooms that would soon be filled with voices and judgment, I felt calm, not excited, not nervous, prepared, because this time, I wasn't the woman who needed approval. I was the woman who owned the door and could decide who was allowed to walk through it. The morning of the housewarming, I woke up before my alarm. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, spilling across hardwood floors that still smelled faintly of fresh polish. For a moment, I lay there listening to the quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty but earned. This house was still new enough that it hadn't absorbed any memories yet. No arguments, no compromises, just space. I walked barefoot through the rooms, checking small details. The flowers on the dining table, the candles in the living room, the framed photos on the shelf. Friends, mentors, moments I'd chosen. Not a single family portrait. That hadn't been intentional at first, but standing there, I realized it felt right. By noon, the caterers arrived. By 2, the house began to fill. Colleagues from work. Friends I'd met along the way. People who knew me not as someone's daughter or sister, but simply as Stella. They complimented the house openly, without calculation. "This place fits you," one friend said. "It feels solid," another added. I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the champagne. Then, around 4 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I already knew who it was. My mother stood on the porch, perfectly composed, wearing the same polite smile she reserved for public settings. Behind her was Ethan, hands in his pockets, eyes already scanning the exterior of the house as if evaluating it. Lauren stood slightly apart, her smile hesitant, the kids fidgeting beside her. "Stella," Mom said, stepping forward to hug me. Her embrace was brief, controlled. "This place is impressive, thank you," I replied evenly, stepping back to let them in. Ethan whistled softly as he crossed the threshold. "Wow," he said, glancing around. "You really went all out." It wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment. As I led them inside, I felt a familiar shift in the air. Ethan walked slowly, deliberately, peering into rooms, opening doors without asking. The kids ran ahead, laughing, their energy bouncing off the walls. "This room is huge," Ethan said, standing in what I had set up as a home office. "You could easily turn this into a bedroom." "For who?" I asked lightly. He chuckled. "You know." Lauren shot him a warning look, but he ignored it. My mother followed behind us, nodding approvingly as she took everything in. "You've always had good taste," she said. "This must have cost a fortune." "It was an investment," I replied. "One I planned carefully." She hummed, non-committal. As more guests arrived, the house filled with conversation and music. For a while, things felt almost normal. My family blended into the background. Ethan laughed with strangers. The kids disappeared upstairs. Lauren stayed close to the snack table, apologizing unnecessarily for everything. I allowed myself to relax. That was my mistake. Halfway through the evening, I noticed Ethan standing near the center of the living room, drink in hand, surrounded by a small group of people. My mother stood beside him, smiling proudly. Something about the way they leaned toward each other made my stomach tighten. Ethan cleared his throat. "You know," he said casually, his voice carrying farther than necessary. "I've been thinking." A few people laughed politely. "This house," he continued, gesturing broadly around him, "is actually perfect for my kids." The laughter faltered. I felt every conversation in the room pause, attention shifting toward us like a slow tide. Before I could respond, my mother stepped in seamlessly, as if they'd rehearsed it. "Stella's always been so independent," she said warmly. "But she doesn't really need all this space. She's single, no kids. This kind of house is much more suited for a family." The word family landed like a verdict. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone set their glass down a little too hard. Lauren's face flushed as she stared at the floor. Ethan nodded, emboldened. "I mean, it just makes sense," he said. "The schools here are great, the art is perfect, and you could easily get a nice condo closer to the city, something more your speed." There it was. Not a suggestion. A solution. My solution. I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to explain, to justify, to smooth things over. Years of conditioning whispered that it would be easier to give in, to laugh it off, to sacrifice quietly and deal with the fallout later. But something inside me stayed still. I looked around the room, at the people watching, at the house I had built, step by step, without help, without permission. This wasn't a private conversation. It was a claim, and claims deserved answers. I took a slow breath. "You're right," I said calmly, meeting Ethan's eyes. "We should talk about what belongs to whom." My mother's smile tightened. "Stella, don't be dramatic." I smiled back, small, controlled. "I'm not," I said. "I'm just prepared." The room went quiet. And as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, I knew this housewarming was over. What came next wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. I let the silence stretch longer than was comfortable. Dozens of eyes were on me now, friends, coworkers, people who had never seen this side of my family before. I could feel the familiar pressure trying to push me into my old role. The accommodating daughter, the reasonable sister, the one who made things easier for everyone else. But I didn't move. Instead, I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. Ethan frowned. "What are you doing?" "I'm agreeing with you," I said calmly. "If we're going to decide who this house is meant for, we should probably start with facts." "Okay." I tapped the screen, then connected my phone to the television mounted above the fireplace. A soft chime sounded as the display mirrored itself, bright and unmistakable. My mother's smile faltered, just slightly. The first document appeared. It looked boring at first glance, legal formatting, dense paragraphs, official seals. But I watched recognition flicker across her face before she could hide it. "What is that?" she asked quickly. "This," I said evenly, "is a notarized financial agreement from 8 years ago. The one you both convinced me to sign when you said it was just temporary." Ethan squinted at the screen. "That doesn't mean anything." "It means," I replied, "that money taken from me was never a gift. It was a loan, one that was never repaid." A murmur rippled through the room. Lauren's eyes widened. "Ethan, what is she talking about?" He didn't answer. He was staring at the screen now, jaw tight. I swiped to the next document. "This one is more interesting," I continued. "These are financial records, accounts opened in my name, without my consent." My mother stepped forward. "Stella, stop this. You're embarrassing us." I didn't look at her. "These accounts were used over a 3-year period." I went on, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "Funds were redirected, debts accumulated, all under my identity." The room had gone completely silent. Someone near the back whispered, "Is this real?" Ethan laughed once, sharp and brittle. "You're exaggerating." I tapped again. The numbers filled the screen. Totals, dates, clear, undeniable trails. Lauren covered her mouth. "Ethan, why is my name on that transfer?" He turned to her, panicked. "You told me we were struggling because of medical bills," she said, her voice trembling. "You said your parents were helping." My mother finally raised her voice. "Enough. This is a family matter. That's exactly why it's here," I replied, in front of everyone. I turned to face her fully now. "You taught me that family means accountability," I said quietly. "I just took you at your word." Her face drained of color. Ethan took a step toward me. "You can't do this." "I already have," I said. And I didn't even show the worst part yet. I hesitated not for effect, but because this was the line I'd never crossed before, the one that made everything irreversible. Then I swiped. The final document appeared, a legal filing, clear, formal, unforgiving. "This," I said, "is a legal notice prepared by my attorney. It outlines exactly why no one here has any claim, moral, financial, or otherwise, to this house or to any asset I own." My mother's voice dropped to a whisper. "You went to a lawyer?" "Yes," I answered, "because last time I tried to handle things privately, I was told I was being selfish." Ethan looked around wildly, realizing for the first time that the room wasn't on his side. Faces that had once smiled politely now watched him with thinly veiled judgment. "This house," I continued, "was purchased solely by me, with funds that can be traced directly to my income. Not family money, not shared resources. Mine." Lauren sank into a chair. "You were going to let them take it?" she asked him quietly. "You were going to let them take her house?" Ethan didn't answer. My mother straightened her shoulders, trying to reclaim authority. "You're twisting things. We were just trying to do what's best for the children." I met her gaze. "You were trying to do what you've always done. Decide that my life matters less because it's quieter." The words landed heavier than any raised voice could have. I took a breath, feeling years of restraint finally loosen. "I love your kids," I said, looking at Ethan. "But loving them doesn't mean erasing myself. It doesn't mean handing over everything I've built just because you're used to taking." No one interrupted me now. "For years," I continued, "I was told I was strong so I didn't need support, independent so I didn't deserve help, single so I didn't require space, security, or respect." I glanced around the room at the house, at the people who had filled it with warmth earlier that day. This is the last time that logic gets applied to me. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. Ethan looked smaller somehow. Not defeated, but exposed. I picked up my phone and disconnected it from the TV. The screen went dark, but the truth stayed bright and undeniable. "This housewarming is over," I said calmly. Anyone who came here to celebrate is welcome to stay. Anyone who came to claim something that isn't theirs can leave. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lauren stood. "We're going," she said quietly, taking the kids' jackets from the hallway. She didn't look at my mother. She barely looked at Ethan. My mother followed, rigid, humiliated, silent. Ethan lingered at the door. For the first time in his life, he didn't have an argument ready. He didn't have a plan. He just looked at me and said, "I didn't think you'd actually fight back." I held his gaze. "That was your mistake." The door closed behind them. And in the stillness that followed, I realized something profound. For the first time in my life, I hadn't lost my family by saying no. I had found myself. For several seconds after the door shut, no one spoke. The music was still playing softly from the speakers, cheerful and wildly out of place. Someone near the kitchen cleared their throat. Another guest quietly set a glass down on the counter, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I stood there, heart racing, hands steady in a way they had never been before. Then, one of my friends exhaled and said gently, "Well, that escalated." A few people let out nervous laughs. The tension loosened, just slightly. "I'm sorry you all had to see that," I said, my voice calm but tired. "This was supposed to be a celebration." "It still is," someone replied. "Just a very honest one." Most of my guests stayed. They didn't ask intrusive questions. They didn't demand explanations. They refilled their drinks, helped clear plates, and treated what had just happened like what it truly was, a boundary being drawn, not a spectacle. That night, after everyone left and the house finally fell quiet, I walked through each room slowly. The same rooms my brother had mentally reassigned to his children hours earlier now felt different, lighter, untouched. I slept better than I had in years. The fallout came quickly. The next morning, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. Her message shifted tones halfway through, from outrage to wounded pride to something that almost sounded like regret. "You humiliated us," she said. "You could have handled that privately." I listened once. I didn't respond. Ethan texted later that week. The message was long, defensive, and full of half-acknowledgements. "I didn't know you felt this strongly. We were just thinking practically. You didn't have to involve lawyers." I read it twice, then put my phone down. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain my feelings in a way that would make them more comfortable. I didn't feel guilty for protecting what was mine. Instead, I set rules. Communication would be written. Financial topics were off limits. My home was not a discussion. Weeks passed. Lauren reached out separately. Her message was short, careful. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "I didn't know, and I should have asked more questions." I appreciated that. I told her the truth, that the kids were never the problem, and never would be. But I also made it clear that I wouldn't be stepping into old patterns again. What surprised me most was how calm my life became once the noise stopped. No constant tension. No preemptive apologies. No bracing myself for the next request disguised as concern. I didn't cut my family off completely. I just stopped negotiating my worth. And in that quiet, I realized something I'd never fully understood before. Standing up for yourself doesn't destroy families. It only destroys the roles that were built on your silence. By choosing myself, I hadn't lost everything. I had finally gained control over my own life, and for the first time, that felt like more than enough. In the months that followed, my life settled into something quieter, steadier than it had ever been. There were no dramatic apologies, no sudden transformations. My mother continued to act as if time alone would soften my boundaries. Ethan alternated between silence and carefully worded messages that avoided responsibility while asking for access. I didn't argue with either of them. I didn't need to. Instead, I focused on building a life that didn't revolve around managing other people's expectations. I hosted dinners for friends who showed up without agendas. I filled my home with routines that grounded me: Sunday mornings with coffee and sunlight, evenings spent reading on the couch I'd chosen. In the living room, no one could claim but me. Occasionally, I felt a twinge of sadness, not for what I lost, but for what I never truly had. A family that could celebrate my success without seeing it as a resource. A mother who didn't confuse control with care. A brother who didn't mistake entitlement for need. But sadness didn't mean regret, because clarity had given me something far more valuable than approval. It gave me peace. I realized that for years, I had confused endurance with strength. I believed being strong meant staying quiet, staying useful, staying available. I thought love was something you earned by giving more and asking less. I was wrong. Real strength is knowing when to stop explaining yourself. Real love doesn't require self-erasure. Real family doesn't demand that one person shrink so others can feel bigger. One evening, standing alone in my kitchen, I looked around at the space I had fought to protect. Not just the walls and floors, but the life inside them. The choices, the boundaries, the calm. This house was never just about money. It was about ownership of my time, my energy, my future. And the document I showed them that night? It wasn't just a legal record. It was proof that I had finally chosen myself, backed by truth, protected by law, and guided by self-respect. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. You don't owe access to people who repeatedly disregard your well-being. You don't owe sacrifice to those who call it family, only when it benefits them. And protecting your peace is not selfish, it's necessary. Some relationships can be repaired with honesty and accountability. Others can only be managed with distance and boundaries. Learning the difference is part of growing up, no matter how late that lesson comes. My housewarming didn't end the way I'd imagined, but it gave me something better than celebration. It gave me freedom. And for the first time in my life, that freedom felt like home.